In today's Locanuq.com episode for May 1st, 2026, we're looking at the end of the one-size-fits-all localization tool. Phrase has launched a verified solutions program to make modular tech stacks safer for enterprises, while We Are Very is ditching the traditional translation grid for a freestyle AI editor that mimics Google Docs. We also dive into RWS's latest executive move in the Americas, signaling a massive pivot toward AI-led content orchestration. Plus, Mozilla shares how context-rich prompting is solving the hallucination problem in production. Welcome to Localization News You Can Use, your daily dose of localization know-how. Imagine this for a second. If a robot misinterprets your hand gesture in Tokyo, who is actually to blame for that? Is it the manufacturer who built the robotic arm, or is it the AI that failed to translate the cultural context of your physical movement? Because translation really isn't just about subtitles on a movie or getting directions from a taxi driver anymore. It is rapidly becoming the invisible operating system for how human beings and machines avoid catastrophic collisions in the real world. We are looking at an industry undergoing a profound transformation right now. There has been this lingering, almost fatalistic narrative over the past few years that AI is simply going to wipe out human translators. Just poof, gone. But the market data completely shatters that assumption. Look at the major market report from Research and Markets. They just projected the global language services market is leaping from $61.48 billion in 2025 to $67.52 billion in 2026. That is nearly a 10% growth rate, and it is expanding precisely because of AI, not in spite of it. So why does this actually matter? Because if AI isn't killing the translation industry, it is forcing the entire field into a state of hyper-specialization. To really grasp these enterprise-level shifts, we have to start with the baseline. And that baseline is the technology that you likely have sitting in your pocket right now, because consumer technology dictates enterprise reality. When you give everyday people access to magical tools, their expectations for what a global brand should deliver just skyrocket. And the tech giants are aggressively raising that baseline right now. Take Google Translate. On April 29th, they didn't just add more languages. They integrated a new AI-powered pronunciation practice feature into Android for English and Spanish. This fundamentally changes the utility of the app. It's no longer just a passive dictionary where you type in a word to show a waiter. It's an active shift. They're using acoustic modeling to compare your specific spoken syllables against a native speaker's waveform in real time to give you immediate feedback. Big tech is actively pivoting from reactive translation to proactive language coaching. They're coming directly for Duolingo's market share, making the smartphone an active voice coach. Then OpenAI drops their massive 2026 updates. They launched a dedicated ChatGPT Translate site and updated their real-time API for voice agents. But the one that really stood out in these tech announcements was ChatGPT Images 2.0. Historically, AI image generators have been terrible at text. They generate shapes that look vaguely like letters, but it's mostly visual gibberish. But this new model finally cracks the tokenization of non-Latin scripts. It can render Chinese characters and Japanese kanji accurately, weaving bilingual text directly into visual narratives. The primary example they used was translating and designing bilingual manga on the fly. What's fascinating here is how this reshapes our fundamental relationship with content. When consumers can access syllable-level acoustic coaching and an AI that acts as a bilingual graphic designer, it normalizes multimodal translation. Text is no longer the default. Audio-first and visual-first localization become the new baseline that massive global brands have to compete against. Note, however, that the OpenAI model still struggles significantly with right-to-left scripts like Arabic and Hebrew. The spatial reasoning of the AI hasn't fully mastered reversing the visual flow yet. But let's look closer at that manga example for a second. Manga relies so heavily on localized slang, visual puns, and specific regional dialects. If ChatGPT still struggles to place Arabic text on the correct side of a page, is it really capturing the cultural nuance of an Osaka dialect in a comic book, or is it just pasting literal, wooden translations into speech bubbles? That is the exact vulnerability global brands are facing right now. The AI can render the visual text perfectly, but the cultural soul is often completely missing, which feels completely flat. And that brings us to the enterprise dilemma. If every brand on Earth has access to the exact same underlying large language models, how does a brand maintain its unique voice? Why don't they all sound like the same generic, slightly polite chatbot? The answer is that brands are abandoning the traditional tools of the trade. They are moving to dynamic, context-heavy platforms. Let's look at the launch of a new multilingual editor from a creative localization agency called We Are Very. The first thing they did was completely ditch the traditional CAT tool, which is a monumental shift for the industry. For context, a CAT tool, a computer-assisted translation tool, has been the standard for decades. It essentially looks like a giant spreadsheet, with the source sentence on the left and a blank box for the translated sentence on the right. That grid format is a nightmare for creative writing because it forces the translator to think in isolated sentences. It strips away the narrative flow. If you are translating a software button that just says home, the spreadsheet doesn't tell you if that means a physical house, the main page of a website, or if it's a verb. So We Are Very built a freestyle workspace that feels a lot more like a collaborative Google Doc, but underneath it is powered by a RAG pipeline. RAG, meaning Retrieval-Augmented Generation, acts as a live tether to the brand's corporate brain. It is feeding the AI the brand's proprietary glossaries, their past translation memories, and their specific style guides in real time. Instead of just feeding raw text into an AI and crossing your fingers, they are essentially uploading the brand's entire cultural and technical rulebook before the AI generates a single word. This is exactly how you cure AI fatigue. Anyone who writes with AI knows the exhaustion of constantly reprompting it to fix its tone. You fix the context, not the model. Phrase, another major industry player, is doing something similar with their new Verified Solutions program. They are building a platform-as-a-service ecosystem that pre-integrates connectors for design tools like Figma, content management systems like Contentful, and language service providers like We Localize. The goal is unbroken context from the designer's screen straight to the translator's workspace. The Mozilla Localization report from April really drives this home too. They saw a massive surge in Firefox Android strings, over 200 new interface strings generated in a single month because they launched a new VPN and a World Cup widget. That is a ton of volume. To handle that volume without losing quality, they updated their internal translation platform, Pontoon. But they didn't upgrade the AI, they upgraded the metadata. They started feeding the language models incredibly rich context data. We're talking about injecting string identifiers, specific project manager instructions, and historical translator comments directly into the prompt, completely invisible to the user. By doing that, the AI stopped making punctuation errors and wildly variable terminology choices. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are looking at something the Global Sake Roundtable at Adobe recently called source-level localization. The old workflow was a very linear process. Write the English copy, finalize it, and then send it off for translation. But the new workflow is creating content that is globally adaptive from the very first draft. The copywriting and the translation are blending into one continuous AI-assisted stream. But here is where it gets tricky. If AI is instantly syncing terminology across globally shared documents, and RAG pipelines are enforcing the brand's tone automatically, the obvious question is why we are still paying human translators at all. What is a human actually doing in a system that's smart? Which is exactly what the European Commission is trying to figure out. They just announced the theme for their Translating Europe Forum 2026, and it is literally titled, Language Professionals Matter, Added Value in a Changing Industry. The key phrase to focus on there is added value. The industry is experiencing the death of the generalist and the rise of the hyper-specialist. Historically, the translation industry was dominated by massive multi-language generalist agencies. Their pitch was basically that they could translate anything into any language. But generalist giants are now suffering from terminology drift. Imagine a generalist agency translating a highly technical engineering manual for a chemical plant. A generalist translator or a generic AI might translate the English term shear strength, into a phrase that legally translates back to cutting power. In a casual conversation, that's fine. But in a chemical manufacturing facility, that terminology drift could cause a catastrophic structural failure. The text is grammatically perfect, but technically disastrous. It produces this stiff, slightly off-kilter output the industry calls translationess. A generalist agency is basically like trying to use Google Maps to navigate the inside of a nuclear power plant. It can reliably get you to the front door, but once you are inside the reactor room, you need a highly specific, custom-built schematic. And that is where single-language pair agencies are dominating. A boutique agency that solely translates from English to Canadian French, specifically Canadian, not European French, will beat a massive global agency for a local compliance contract every time. They aren't just translating words, they are building the schematics. Look at Talking China, a major language service provider. They just announced a shift to what they call a consultative localization model, specifically targeting the chemical, machinery, and electronics sectors. They implemented something called a WDTP QA system. That stands for Workflow, Database, Technical Tools, and People. It is really fascinating that people is categorized right alongside the databases because the people are performing double verification. They are taking the AI output and embedding the specialized terminology directly into the client's regulatory compliance frameworks. The line between a technology vendor and a human consultancy has completely vanished. The preliminary 2026 NIMSY 100 ranking, which is the definitive list of the world's largest language service providers, proves this. For the first time ever, they updated their qualifiers to include pure tech platforms like DeepL and SmartLing on the exact same list as traditional human agencies like TransPerfect. This hybrid specialist model is the new economic reality. Let's look at the flip side. Let's say a mobile brand executive decides to cheap out. They look at the budget, decide they don't need the hyper-specialist neurosurgeons of language, and just use a massive generalist agency or raw AI to launch a marketing campaign overseas. What is the actual fallout there? The fallout hits you like a freight train in two specific places: your legal department and your bottom line. Let's start with legal. The Global Advertising Lawyers Alliance recently held their annual conference in London, and the dominant topic wasn't copyright. It was claim substantiation and greenwashing. Because words have legal definitions, especially regarding environmental impact. Imagine a brand uses an LLM to translate an English ad campaign about environmentally friendly packaging for the German market. The AI hallucinates slightly and selects a German phrase that legally implies the packaging is 100% biodegradable. If that ad goes live and violates strict EU consumer protection laws, the brand gets hit with a massive fine for greenwashing. You can't tell regulators the AI chose that word. The brand holds the liability. Literal translation is entirely dead in cross-border marketing because it carries way too much legal risk. Human experts are being hired for risk mitigation, but it's not just regulatory fines. It is direct revenue loss. A recent report analyzed Korean brands expanding internationally. They are spending heavily on global visibility, but they are bleeding buyers at the content execution stage. They get the customer to the website, but the localized messaging relies on literal translations that fail to meet the cultural expectations of international buyers, and their conversion metrics just tank. This objectively proves that localization quality is directly correlated to revenue performance. Organizations dealing with highly sensitive topics understand this implicitly. The Global Fund for Women recently issued a massive RFP for translation into Arabic, Tagalog, French, and Latin American Spanish. They explicitly stated they were looking for localization and cultural adaptation consulting. They don't want word swappers. They need human cultural validation to ensure their messaging lands safely and effectively in volatile regions. But surely there has to be a scenario where raw, fast machine translation is the right business move, right? There is. And it usually involves high volume, low nuance data, where speed is the only metric that matters. Look at Hyoki EE Corporation in Japan. On May 1st, they published an official financial disclosure regarding a treasury stock acquisition. Right on the very first page is a massive, prominent machine translation disclaimer. It explicitly states the English version was generated via machine translation, and if there is any discrepancy, the original Japanese version is the legally binding document. So for financial data where global investors need the numbers immediately and frankly don't care about poetic phrasing, raw MT is an accepted legal standard. They just use the disclaimer as a shield. The reference-only translation market is booming because data updates are continuous. So you have AI handling the bulk reference-level data and human specialists moving up the value chain to handle legal compliance and deep cultural adaptation. Which brings us to the part of the industry that is genuinely blowing minds right now. If humans are stepping up into these strategic legal roles, bleeding-edge technology is stepping completely off the screen. We are entering the era of agentic AI and physical AI. Let's define agentic AI first. A company called Green Cabbage just launched a platform called Harvest. This isn't an AI that translates text. This is an autonomous AI agent designed for global procurement. It autonomously scans global market rates for language services, benchmarks costs against historical data, and actively negotiates contracts with vendors. Yes, an AI is autonomously negotiating the price of human translations. It's managing the business logic of the localization industry itself. But giving an AI agent access to corporate budgets and production databases is an immense security risk, and the industry knows it. That is exactly why the Cloud Security Alliance, specifically the CAI Foundation, just launched the Agentic Trust Framework and the STAR for AI Catastrophic Risk Annex. In early 2026, unmanaged autonomous AI agents started causing a spike in security incidents by hallucinating business logic or exposing private databases. The framework is the scaffolding required to keep these negotiating agents from going rogue.